A good Erev Shabbos. If you really would like some insight into Moshe's humility and his greatness, this week's Parsha is a great place to find it. You'll recall that there is no portion in the Torah called Moshe. We don't have a Shabbat Moshe Rabbeinu. We don't have Parshas Moshe, not even for any of his kids. But this week we do have a portion named for Moshe's father-in-law, Jethro, or Yisro, or Yitro. That in itself is something inspiring. No less inspiring is that in the beginning of the portion, we see Moshe Rabbeinu and his father-in-law's warm relationship as they greet each other with love and sit down to eat together. Yisro has a message to give to Moshe, and Moshe listens carefully to his father-in-law. And then, as if that weren't enough, Moshe takes the advice and acts on it. He implements the suggestion that Yisro made. It's very hard for many people to take criticism, even harder to listen to it with depth of feeling, and really a rare and prized quality to act on it practically and implement someone else's suggestion. How much more so when it comes from a parent or a parent-in-law? Probably most people who have ever been someone's child or parent-in-law will resonate with that. Now, what was this suggestion? The observation on the part of Yisro was that Moshe Rabbeinu was working way too hard. He was working too hard. Moshe was the rabbi and the judge of all Israel, the entire Jewish people, such that whenever anyone had a dispute or a question, they would come to Moshe to explain the issue, to be heard, and to receive guidance or a decision or a judgment of what was warranted in this particular situation. Now, for some historical context, you see, back in those days, the Jewish people did not always get along well with one another. Pause for laughter. As you can well imagine, there were disputes, there were arguments, there were feuds, and just plain old questions about what to do as a responsible Jew and how to do it. Remember that in those days, not only was there no Google, there was no WhatsApp, but even more Art Scroll hadn't even been invented yet. So people really had nowhere to turn other than their rabbi, and that was Moshe Rabbeinu, all alone. And since he was the only one, it took a lot of time. God always gives us the strength to do the job we're called to do, but there are only so many hours in the day. So Yisro said to Moshe, why don't you make a system of courts, a judicial system where you won't have to be the only one reviewing cases and deciding. There will be a bureaucracy of sorts, but in the good sense, that will adjudicate cases, lessen your workload so that you'll be able to actually lead the nation. Now, the Torah's story pivots from this point forward up until now. Since we began reading the Torah, Bereshit, at Simchas Torah, we had the patriarchs, the matriarchs, the descent into Egypt, and the years of slavery, the redemption, the rescue at the sea, and now in this week's portion, giving of the Torah. From this point on until next Simchas Torah, we'll read about the laws that guide and shape Jewish life, how to make this world and our lives in it a place where God can dwell. We'll read about a few misadventures in the desert that cause our sojourn there to be much longer than anticipated. And finally, in Devarim, in Deuteronomy, a restatement of the law as it pertains to us going into the Promised Land and making Israel the Jewish people's permanent home. So the Jewish nation changes its central identity at this point. We've already evolved from being a big family to a nation of slaves to a nation of free people. And at Sinai, we become a nation dedicated to living holy, godly lives. And in order to do that, we're going to need to know what that looks like in daily practice. For those who are worried that too many rules will slow us down and shackle us in antiquated practice, you can take great comfort in the observation of the great German poet Goethe, who wrote, "In limitation, the master truly shows himself, and only the law can make us free." And for others of us wondering, well, is it only the Jewish people who have to follow these rules? How about all of mankind? Shouldn't everyone be following the law? The Talmud asks the same question in the middle of Sanhedrin, page 56b, where the Gemara enters into the question of the Torah's expectations of legal behavior for all of humankind. This discussion comes to center around the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, 7 commandments for the sons of Noah. That is the Jewish view of morality and justice for all human beings. There are actually 6 prohibitions and only 1 obligation. The 6 prohibitions are idolatry, blasphemy, murder, forbidden relationships, theft, and cruelty to animals. The sole obligation, the one thing that's incumbent upon humankind to do, is to establish courts of law and uphold a system of justice. So the conversation here is definitely relevant to an audience beyond Machaneh Yisrael, outside the boundaries of the Jewish community. After Moshe and his father-in-law Yisro greet each other warmly and sit down to share their dinner together, Moshe gets up the next day to go to work. Yisro sees that Moshe's caseload extends from sunup to sundown. So he asks his very hard-working son-in-law, "What is this thing that you do to the people? Why do you sit yourself with the people standing before you from morning to evening?" Moshe answers, this is chapter 18, verses 15 and 16. He says, "Because the people come to me to seek God. When they have a matter of dispute, they come to me, and I adjudicate between plaintiffs, and I make God's laws known to them." Then Yisro says, "It's not good what you're doing. You'll surely become worn out. Navol tibol," he says, "you will surely wear yourself out." Or Chaim says it uses 2 words because fatigue comes in 2 stages. One, you feel tired, but you think you can carry on. And there's a second stage when it's just too much and you simply cannot anymore. Yisro says to Moshe, "You'll surely become worn out, as you as well as the people that are with you. For this matter is too hard for you. You will not be able to do it alone." Then he says, Moshe should continue to teach, but he should set up a system. He says, "Discern from among the people, men of accomplishment, God-fearing people, men of truth, men who despise money, and you shall appoint them as leaders of thousands, leaders of hundreds, leaders of 50s, and leaders of 10s. They shall judge the people constantly, and they will bring the major decisions to you, but they will resolve the smaller disputes themselves. That'll be easier for you and for them, and in this way it'll be much better for everyone in the short term and in the long term." So this first management consultant's case study in Torah is no less a blueprint for a society based on laws and transparency and accountability, as we hope all societies would ultimately be, no matter what their identity or composition might be. As a management consultant, before that became an actual job description, Yisro boldly added this whole section to the Torah, in effect. And it shows us something very important, not just that Moshe was willing to accept the critique and the suggestion, but that Yisro, who was what we now call a Jew by choice, had the insight and intelligence to see a problem that apparently, perhaps, Moshe was not able to discern or to solve, probably because he was right in the thick of it. Now, many commentaries, we should note, don't agree with that point of view. Abarbanel understands that Yisro's recommendations did not, in fact, add any dimensions to the Torah, but because of his good intentions, the Torah wanted to reward that and give him some credit. The Sifri, a collection of Midrash, asks rhetorically in Parshas Behalaischa, was Moshe himself unaware of the system that Yisro described? Answers his own question, saying he actually knew it and forgot it for a moment, and that gave Yisro a chance at some merit for suggesting it. Abarbanel's thought is that Moshe knew well that one person alone could not possibly provide leadership for an entire nation, but he thought that since God was in the middle of revealing the divine plan and directive for Am Yisrael, for the Jewish people, Moshe thought surely the judicial hierarchy would be part of that and it would be transmitted in due course. So he only had to wait patiently to receive that part of the instruction. It was not necessary for him to analyze and dissect and determine the challenges and so-called flaws in the system. Everything would become clear with time. Maybe even of more interest to us is the qualities that are discussed here as necessary for a qualified and impartial judiciary. We do live in a time when the judicial process is highly politicized. If you recall, before the war began in Israel, almost 500 days ago, the main conflict within Israeli society was over the appointment of judges and who exactly would have the final say and who would be part of that process, which is precisely what this week's portion is about. By the way, some of us were having a conversation this week about common sense, and it was suggested that one element of common sense is that we have something in common, namely that we all read the same portion of Torah in Shul on Shabbat, whether you're in Toronto or Tahiti or Tajikistan. Reading the same parsha, all of us, wherever we are, establishes some commonality, a shared text. We can all disagree on how to interpret, but at least when we try to apply our sense, it's to something that we do have in common. Now, it's unclear whether the judges that are supposed to be appointed under this new scheme should each of them should have all the necessary qualities of a judge. That seems like a tall order a little bit. Or maybe it is too much to ask. So each aspect is the quality desired in a judge at this rank or that rank. In other words, judges of thousands should be anshe chayil, men of accomplishment. Judges of hundreds should possess yiras shamayim, appropriate awe of heaven. Judges of 50s should be anshe emes, men of truth. And judges of tens should at least be sonei betza, those who scorn financial considerations. It seems from this whole conversation that Yisro was the first to suggest that government include the notion of separation of powers, that the people making the laws and the people enforcing the laws would be two different groups. In fact, one view, quoted in the name of the Gra, says that Yisro was recommending both a court system and an educational system. The idea was that the judges of thousands and the judges of hundreds would hear and adjudicate cases, while the judges of 50s and the judges of 10s would take responsibility to teach and to instruct the people. Judges of 10s would also rotate in as bailiffs, as we'll see later in our Torah reading this year. It's an interesting subject of debate among commentaries as how this more democratic but less equal system came to be. Some say Moshe wanted to keep things as egalitarian as possible, as long as possible. He was hesitant to introduce a hierarchy with higher courts and lower courts, even though he himself would be at the top of the organizational chart. Yisro saw the situation as needing a practical solution that was more sustainable, no matter what changes would have to take place. That's always part of the equation. Or maybe Moshe saw people as they could be, at his level, in potential. And that's why he wanted to engage with each and every Jew at some time or other. He knew he could bring people up to that level of awareness and consciousness. While Yisro came from beyond the camp. That's actually the beginning of this week's Parsha's first verse. Not in Yiddish, but I'm saying what my grandmother used to say, Agas toifavayil zeit amayil. When you come from outside, you see things that insiders don't necessarily notice. Whether or not we would have made it without this suggestion, without Yisro's suggestion, or if we would have figured it out or had it explained to us in a different way, the commentaries agree that Yisro's name is related to Yeter. He added, he contributed his part as best he could to Jewish society. That in itself is a lesson. Always to offer to participate and to give rather than only take. It should continue to be an inspiration. A good Shabbos.